In the last 10 minutes, Sara Netanyahu proceeded by avarice of other first wives. In the last half hour, Israeli PM's wife charged with fraud. Netanyahu wife charged with fraud in gourmet meals affair. Sara Netanyahu, Israeli PM's wife, charged with fraud over lavish meals in the last hour. Sara Netanyahu's lawyer: fraud indictment is ridiculous and bizarre. Benjamin Netanyahu's wife charged with misuse of public funds. Netanyahu's wife charged with fraud, breach of trust in the last 2 hours. Sara Netanyahu charged with fraud, breach of trust. Benjamin Netanyahu's wife indicted on fraud in prepared food affair. Netanyahu's wife charged with misuse of public funds. Sara Netanyahu charged with misuse of public funds. Israeli leader's wife Sara Netanyahu charged with fraud in the last 4 hours. Sara Netanyahu charged with fraud. Israel PM Netanyahu's wife charged with $100,000 meal fraud. Netanyahu's wife charged for misusing $100,000 in public funds to order meals. Israeli PM's wife Sara Netanyahu charged with fraud in residence affair. Netanyahu's wife charged with fraud. Sara Netanyahu, Israeli Prime Minister's wife, is charged with fraud. Sara Netanyahu charged in corruption probe. Israeli leader Netanyahu's wife charged with fraud. Sara Netanyahu indicted on fraud charges in Israel. Sara Netanyahu, wife of Israeli leader, charged with fraud. Netanyahu wife charged with fraud, misuse of funds. Wife of Israeli PM Netanyahu charged with fraud. Sara Netanyahu accused of $100,000 takeout fraud. Sara Netanyahu indicted over misuse of NIS $360,000 in state funds. Israeli leader's wife charged with fraud. Israeli Prime Minister's wife, Sara Netanyahu, indicted for fraud. Israeli PM's wife Sara Netanyahu charged with fraud and breach of trust. Israeli PM Benjamin Netanyahu's wife is charged with fraud. Sara Netanyahu charged with fraud for $100,000 in freebie meals. Sara Netanyahu indicted for fraud over restaurant meals. Sara Netanyahu, wife of Israeli PM, charged with fraud. Sara Netanyahu charged with fraud and breach of trust. Israeli PM Netanyahu's wife Sara charged with fraud. Benjamin Netanyahu's wife Sara charged with fraud. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's wife charged with fraud in the last 6 hours. Sara Netanyahu, wife of Israeli Prime Minister, charged with fraud. Israeli PM Netanyahu's wife charged with fraud. Justice Ministry says Israeli PM Benjamin Netanyahu's wife charged with fraud. Israeli PM's wife charged with fraud, breach of trust. Sara Netanyahu, wife of Israel's PM, charged with fraud. Benjamin Netanyahu's wife charged with fraud. Sara Netanyahu indicted for fraud in residence affair. Netanyahu's wife indicted on fraud charges. Israeli PM's wife charged with fraud over misuse of funds. Sara Netanyahu indicted in residence affair. Sara Netanyahu indicted for falsely charging state $100,000 for meals in the last 7 days. Netanyahu's wife Sara to be indicted within days. Sara Netanyahu expected to be charged next week for misuse of state funds. Sara Netanyahu likely indicted next week in residence affair. In the last month, Netanyahu completes 6-hour police questioning in corruption case. Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu questioned in corruption case. Netanyahu questioned by police for third time in corruption investigation. Netanyahu questioned again in Bezik Walla affair. Police question Netanyahu in telecom giant corruption case. Netanyahu enters another round of questioning over Bezik affair. Sara Netanyahu indictment to be decided on within days. Giuliani, Mueller team trying to frame Trump. Netanyahu case is a joke. Yeah, Netanyahu puts Facebook skills to use in new social media job. Sara Netanyahu forcibly removed from angry meeting with PMO director. Sara Netanyahu responds to accusations. Sara Netanyahu tried to physically attack Bibi's top aide. Sara Netanyahu tried to physically attack her husband's top aide. Actor Sara Netanyahu, give back state funds, then he'll decide on indictment. AG said set to indict Sara Netanyahu for misuse of state funds. Report, AG's mind made up to indict Sara Netanyahu in residence affair. Report, Sara Netanyahu to be indicted. Netanyahu to be questioned for 10th time on June 12. Netanyahu denies seeking armored car for wife. Netanyahu, fake news spreading lies about my wife Sara Netanyahu, let me live in quiet.